Daniel chapter 8. We're going to read from verse 1 all the way through to verse 27 at the end of the chapter. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled?" The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot. He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." And he came near the place where I was standing. I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will rise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true. But seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Well, we are on Daniel chapter 8 this evening, and we're going to spend the next 2 weeks looking at this really weird vision that Daniel saw. And as we look at this vision, we're going to do 3 things. We're going to see the vision itself, see what Daniel saw. We're going to see what the vision actually means. And we're also going to see how this vision applies to us thousands of years later on. But I want to start tonight by giving you a feel for the chapter. See, this chapter comes in 2 parts. In part 1, which is verse 1 to verse 14, we have the vision itself, and then verse 15 to the end, we have Gabriel explaining the vision for us. And the vision itself, it has 3 parts. We have a ram with 2 horns, we have a goat with a prominent horn, and then we have the horn that was broken off. And Gabriel explains for us that each part of this vision, each of those 3 sections, is describing for us a different period in the history of the world and especially of God's people. So tonight we're going to see the first 2 parts. Next week we're going to see the 3rd part. So let's jump straight in. Now, notice verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision. Notice in verse 2, the vision takes place in Susa. And then in verse 3, Daniel tells us exactly what he sees. He says, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. Now this second half of Daniel, it's written in what we might call Apocalyptic Style, something we discussed a number of weeks ago. And in this style of writing, a horn is a symbol. It's a symbol of someone really, really powerful. But notice there is a twist in verse 4. We see there that one of the horns, verse 3 rather, one of the horns was longer than the others, but it grew up later. So in other words, you look at this ram and it has 2 horns. It has one big horn and one small horn. But as you watch, the small horn grows and grows and grows until it is the bigger of the 2. And then verse 4, notice how aggressive this ram is. I'm sure maybe some of our sheep farmers can sympathise. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. And notice how powerful he is. Also verse 4, no animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. So this ram may not be the king of the jungle, but he is the undisputed king of the farmyard. But notice that all of that changes once we reach verse 5. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. Then in verse 6, the goat charges at the ram. Then verse 7, I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering the 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. So this ram, he looked like he was completely unstoppable. He looked like he could bully and bulldoze anybody who got in his way. I mean, if it's not too confusing to throw another animal into the mix, it looked like he was going to be top dog until the end of time. And then, in the space of just a few verses, what happens to the ram? He's a crumpled heap on the ground. we have this goat with a prominent horn, and the goat gives the ram an absolute thrashing. And so now, obviously, the goat is the one who's in control. Obviously, there is no one who can possibly stand in his way. Or so you might think. But notice verse 8. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. So right as this goat reaches the very peak of its powers, everything comes crashing down. And that actually sets the scene for even more drama, and we're going to see even more drama in the next part of the chapter that we'll look at next week. But for now, having seen the ram, having seen the goat, having seen the conflict between them, we want to ask, what's it all about? What does all this mean? And thankfully, we're not left to work this out ourselves, because Gabriel appears to Daniel and he explains it to Daniel starting in verse 15. And I want you to notice verse 20, because by the time we reach verse 20, Gabriel gets to the nitty-gritty and he tells us the 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. Now, we have seen Media and Persia already in Daniel. Back in chapter 5, do you remember the king of Babylon, King Belshazzar? He sees the writing on the wall. Do you remember the mysterious fingers that appeared? And that very night, the Persians come and they conquer Belshazzar's kingdom. We've also seen, back in chapter 2, that Persia was one of the kingdoms that makes up the statue in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And we saw just a few weeks ago, Persia was the vicious bear that devoured much flesh in chapter 7. And so, whenever you realise who this ram is, whenever you realise that it is Persia, the vision starts to make a lot of sense. For example, do you remember in verse 3 how the ram had 2 horns? Well, one of those horns is Media, the other is Persia. Now, I would love to go into the whole story, but I really don't think everybody would thank me for getting into the history. But the Medes and the Persians, if you could put it this way, they were a bit like cousins. They were on the same team, but they were pretty distinct. They weren't quite the same. And for a very, very long time, the Medes were the dominant players. They were the ones who called the shots. The king was a Mede, and the capital city was in Media. And the Persians were second class. But then there was a man called Cyrus. And Cyrus rose to power in Persia, and Cyrus was absolutely brilliant. And he went to war with the king of the Medes. And he won. And after he won, it was the Persians who were calling the shots. And so hopefully you can understand why the horn that rises second becomes the bigger of the 2. Notice as well what this ram does in verse 4. He charges north and south and west. In other words, he goes every direction other than east. And if you were to read about Persia in history books, you would see how apt this is. The Persian Empire, it did go east, but their most famous victories and their most important victories were in the other 3 directions. It went north. You can look it up on a map. Persia is where Iran is today. It went north, and it conquered land on both sides of the Caspian Sea. It went south into Egypt and into Libya. And some of its most famous victories of all were in the west. There was Lydia, which is in modern-day Turkey. There was Syria, and there was even Babylon itself. The Persian Empire did exactly what God said it would back in chapter 7. Remember, God describes it as a ravenous bear that gobbles up flesh. Well, that's exactly what the Persians did. And for quite some time, it seemed like the Persians were absolutely indestructible. It seemed like they were just going to keep on going, trouncing more and more enemies. Until the balance of power suddenly shifts. It shifts to the west, because there is someone who comes on the scene, and he is far, far greater than Cyrus, and far greater than any of the Persian kings who followed him. And that is what we read about in verses 5 to 8. Now, those verses are explained for us in verse 21. The shaggy goat is the king, or the kingdom, of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. Well, who is this king who comes from the west? Well, I'd imagine that some of you might just recognize him whenever I say his name. This king, I think, is very obviously Alexander the Great. And if you know anything at all about Alexander, you will know that verse 5 to verse 8 is a really, really good description of some of the things that he did. Notice in verse 5, he comes from the west without touching the ground. In other words, he travels incredibly quickly. And sure enough, if you were to read history books about Alexander, one of the things that really comes through is the incredible speed with which he travelled across the world. He was able to move his armies at a lightning pace. He was able to smash his enemies when they weren't expecting it and where they weren't expecting it. In fact, people still write books about it today. Notice verse 6. The goat comes to the ram and it attacks, and the ram was powerless to stand against him. And you know, that's exactly what happened. Alexander took on the Persians and he absolutely trounced them. He had way fewer men than they did, and yet he absolutely wiped the floor with the Persian army. And he smashed Persia to smithereens. He added Persia to his own empire, and then he kept on going. You know, something that'd be useful to do later on would be to look up a modern day map of the world. And look at Turkey, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Iran, look at Afghanistan, and look at Pakistan. Well, Alexander conquered all of, or large parts of those countries. And that's just what he ruled in the East. I mean, nobody ever had a kingdom like Alexander had in all of history up to that point. You know, I think a number of weeks ago, I think I shared the famous quote about Alexander, but I'm going to share it again. It's about the time when supposedly he surveyed all of these different countries and territories that he had conquered, and the quote goes, Alexander wept because there were no more worlds to conquer. I mean, is it any wonder he's known as Alexander the Great? And here, I think, is the most impressive thing of all. When Alexander smashed the Persian Empire to smithereens, when he became the undisputed most powerful man on the entire planet, how old do you think he was? He was 25. And yet, I want you to notice what happens next in the vision. Notice verse 8. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. Now, there was no one who was even close to being strong enough to defeat Alexander in battle. And yet, one day, Alexander got a fever. A few days later, he wasn't able to speak. And within 2 weeks, he was dead. And historians debate what happened. Was he poisoned? Did he have typhoid fever? Did he have some form of meningitis? Nobody knows. But what we do know is he was 32 years old. At the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. Maybe it was meningitis, maybe it was poisoning, but we know for a fact it was God who was in control. Now, Alexander's death was dramatic, and it was really like a domino falling down. It started a whole chain reaction, and so there is loads more drama for us to see next week. But for now, I want us to learn 2 lessons from this chapter. And don't worry, there'll be plenty more lessons next week. And the 2 lessons are these. First of all, you can trust the Bible. Secondly, you can trust God. So you can trust the Bible and you can trust God. You know, something that I think has been really obvious over the last number of days is that it is really tough to make predictions. Just think of all of the pollsters in America, and they have spent months and months and months. They've been analysing the trends, they've been examining the demographics, and they've been coming up with these models and these predictions that are based on all the evidence they can find. And to be fair, they have been mostly right. And yet, there are some states, and they have been way off. And so, the question I want to ask is, how do you make a prediction without getting egg on your face? And I can think of at least 2 strategies. The first strategy is this. You make your prediction so vague, so general, that it's almost impossible to prove it wrong. I mean, that's exactly what horoscopes are all about, isn't it? You know, just out of interest, just for the laugh, I suppose, I looked up a few horoscopes this week, and here are 3 of the predictions. Prediction number 1. You are likely to go through a period that is closely linked to your past. Wow. So profound, isn't it? Prediction 2. Try to be as clear as possible with others. If you don't, your proposals will fall on deaf ears. And that's just what I needed to hear. Because I thought to myself, well, I'm preaching in Daniel chapter 8 on Sunday evening, and if I'm not clear whenever I speak, people aren't going to hear me. So profound, isn't it? Prediction number 3. The changes you've been going through lately aren't completely finished. I mean, it's utter piffle, isn't it? The people who write these horoscopes, they never stick their necks in the line. There is always some way that you can twist them, and you can change them, and you can make them fit. But Daniel chapter 8, it really couldn't be any more different, could it? You can't twist this to make it fit. It is so incredibly specific. It tells us about 2 different kingdoms, and it tells us them by name. The Medo-Persian Empire and the Greek Empire. And it specifically tells us that the second part of the Medo-Persian Empire is the one that's going to come to prominence. It tells us that the Greeks are going to come from the west with incredible speed. And it tells us that they're going to absolutely annihilate the Persians. It even tells us that this great king who rises up will be cut down at the peak of his power. And by the way, next week we're going to see the third part of the vision. If anything, it actually gets even more specific. Do you see, in this chapter, the Bible's reputation is completely on the line. If all these years pass and the Greeks don't quite make it, or if, say, the Medes are able to get one over on the Persians, well then this chapter is wrong. And if this chapter is wrong, surely you cannot believe a single word that you find in this book. You know, sometimes people ask, is there actually any evidence that the Bible is actually true? Well, yes, there is. What about Daniel chapter 8? There's no fence sitting. There's no vagueness. There's no hiding behind clever phrases. All we have in this chapter are detailed, specific predictions, and they all came true. So that's the first strategy, by the way, in making a successful prediction. You make it so vague and so general that it can't possibly be disproven. The second way is not quite as easy, certainly not foolproof, but the second way to make a successful prediction is to make an educated guess. And I want you to imagine that we were creating a time capsule, and we're going to put things into this capsule, and then we're going to bury it, and we're going to leave instructions, and in 200 years, this time capsule is going to be dug up. And suppose we had a series of questions about what the future is going to be like. And one of the questions is this: who is going to be the most powerful country in the world in the year 2220? Well, I wonder, what might you say? What might you guess? Some of you, I'm sure, those who don't want to make bold predictions, you might go for the status quo. You might say the United States of America. Some of you, maybe, you might look at what's going on behind the scenes in the Middle East, and you might say Russia is going to be the top dog. I would imagine a lot of people would go for China, and China would make a lot of sense. If you were feeling really, really brave, you might go for one of the enormous countries that has massive economic growth, somewhere like Brazil or like India. But no one in their right mind is going to pick Burundi or Uzbekistan. That wouldn't make any sense whatsoever. And yet, that's what this chapter does. Greece was not a threat. In fact, Greece wasn't even a country. Greece was a bunch of independent city-states. You had Spartans, you had Athenians, you had Thespians, you had Thebans, and they weren't off conquering enemies away over there. They were kicking each other's heads in. They hated each other. And I can't help but wonder, what did the people who first read this prophecy actually think of it? I mean, it must sound about as barmy to them as someone saying to us that one day Cambodia is going to trounce China would sound to us. And yet, every step of the way, it's been proven right. We see in verse 1 that Daniel saw this vision in the year 550 BC. We know that because it was the third year of King Belshazzar's reign. The Persian army, it didn't take over Babylon for another decade. The Greek Empire, it didn't win those battles against Persia for another 200 years. And by the way, whenever Daniel wrote this, Alexander wasn't even born. And the third part of the dream, the part we're going to see next week, those weren't going to happen for another 375 years. There is incredible evidence that we can trust the Bible. But it's also incredible evidence, not just that we can trust the Bible, but that we can trust the God who wrote the Bible. How is it that God is able to say so definitively exactly what is going to happen hundreds of years down the line? Well, it's because He decides what's going to happen hundreds of years down the line. Way back in chapter 2, Daniel says this: "Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are His. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them." I mean, is that not the message that our world needs to hear? Who decides who will be the next occupant of the Oval Office? It's not the voters of Pennsylvania. It's not the Supreme Court of the United States. It is the God who raised up Alexander and who brought him down again. What is going to determine if we have a normal Christmas this year? Or even if we have a normal 2021? It's not the scientists researching the vaccine. It's not the various governments imposing lockdowns. It's not the World Health Organization. It's not even the virus itself either mutating or dying out. Over and above every single news story that you have followed this year so far is the Messiah who is on the throne. Last Sunday evening, sorry about the technical issues, but we met together on Zoom. Last Sunday evening, we looked at the very last words of this Messiah before he left the world. But what did he say just before those words? Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And surely that means we can trust Jesus. We can trust him with COVID. We can trust him with lockdown. You can trust him with your test results. You can trust him with those loved ones and you just don't know how to help them. Because what does Jesus say to us? He's not like Alexander. He's not like Cyrus. He doesn't live in some luxury palace where he never has to meet his people. Jesus says in those words we looked at last Sunday evening, I am with you always. And so you can trust him. You can trust him to see you through. And this evening, if you're not yet a Christian, the most important thing you can hear isn't that you can trust the Bible, although there's not much more important than that. The most important thing you can hear is that you can trust Jesus himself. And Jesus makes the same offer to you that he makes to the rest of us. He says, come to me, and I will be your king, and you will be part of my kingdom. Come to me, and you can know my presence, and you can know my keeping. Come to me in this tumultuous world, and I will give you rest. You can trust the book of the King, and you can trust the King himself, the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's pray.